You wake up before the sun. There's no glass in your window, just a wooden shutter, and it's letting in cold air and the smell of the animals sleeping in the next room. Yes, the next room. Because the cow and the chickens live with you. That's not a joke. That's just Tuesday. You haven't brushed your teeth because toothbrushes don't exist yet where you live. You chew on a twig, maybe rub a cloth with salt over your teeth if you're feeling fancy. You put on the same clothes you wore yesterday because you own maybe 2 outfits total. And washing them is a whole production involving a river, lye soap, and half your morning. And here's the thing, you're not miserable. You don't know you're medieval. You don't think you're living in a dark age. You're just living. Farming, gossiping, praying, falling in love, getting into fights over a fence line. A normal human life, just with worse dentistry and no Wi-Fi. That's what this video is actually about. Not knights in shining armor, not dragons, not Hollywood mud. What did an actual day look like for an actual person? Somewhere between the years 500 and 1500. Grab a coffee. They didn't have that either. And let's get into it. Part 1. Who are we even talking about? First thing to clear up, medieval is not one thing. It's 1,000 years. Saying life in the Middle Ages is like someone from the year 3000 saying life in the modern era and lumping together 1050 and the invention of smartphones. A peasant in the year 700 and a merchant in the year 1450 have almost nothing in common, except that historians filed them under the same folder. So for this video, we're mostly zooming in on Western Europe, roughly the 1000s to the 1300s, what historians call the High Middle Ages. This is the period most people picture when they think medieval, castles, cathedrals, knights, plagues, kings. It's also the period we actually have the most records for. So we're not just guessing. And another thing worth saying up front, around 85 to 90% of people were peasants. Farmers, not knights, not lords, not monks copying manuscripts by candlelight. Regular working people, tied to the land, growing food for everyone else. So if we want to understand medieval life, we mostly need to understand their life, not the 1% in castles. Part 2, the house you lived in. Picture a one-room building, maybe 2 rooms if your family was doing okay. Walls made of wattle and daub, basically woven sticks packed with mud and straw. A thatched roof, a dirt floor, sometimes covered with straw or rushes that got swept out and replaced when they got to disgusting, which, let's be honest, didn't happen often enough. There's a hearth in the middle or against one wall, and smoke just goes wherever it wants. Some houses had a hole in the roof for it. Most didn't. Not really. You lived your whole life slightly smoky, like a cured ham. Furniture was minimal. A table, maybe some stools, a chest for anything valuable, and bedding. Often just a straw mattress on a wooden frame, shared by the whole family, sometimes with the family dog for warmth. Privacy as a concept basically didn't exist. You grew up sleeping in the same room as your parents, your siblings, and occasionally a goat that got cold outside. And animals living indoors wasn't laziness. It was strategy. Body heat from livestock helped keep the house warmer in winter, and it meant nobody was stealing your chickens overnight. Practical, if a little smelly by our standards. Part 3, what did people actually eat? This is where a lot of the myths fall apart. People assume medieval food was gray slop and rotten meat covered in spices to hide the smell. That's mostly nonsense. Spoiled meat could kill you, and people knew that. Nobody was casually eating rotten meat and hoping for the best. The real diet, for most peasants, was built around bread. Bread wasn't a side dish, it was the meal. Dense, dark, made from whatever grain grew locally, rye, barley, sometimes wheat if you were lucky or wealthy. White bread was actually a status symbol because refining flour took more work and wasted more grain. The poorer you were, the darker and coarser your bread. Alongside bread, you had pottage, basically a thick stew of vegetables, grains, and beans, sometimes with a little meat if you had it, simmered in a pot that just never really got fully emptied. You'd add to it day after day onions, cabbage, peas, turnips, whatever was in season. Meat was for special occasions. For most peasants, a pig slaughtered in autumn, salted and smoked to last through winter. Fish was common near rivers or the coast. And on top of that, the church required fasting from meat on Fridays and during Lent. So fish became a huge part of the diet for religious reasons as much as practical ones. Output_path. And ale. People drank a lot of ale, including kids. But it's important to say this wasn't because water was undrinkable and everyone was walking around buzzed. That's actually a popular myth. Water was often fine to drink. Ale was just cheap, filling, calorie-dense, and safer in cities where wells could get contaminated. Think of it more like a low-alcohol nutritional drink than a party. Spices, by the way, were for rich people. Pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, these traveled thousands of miles on trade routes and cost a fortune. If you were wealthy, showing off spices at dinner was basically the medieval version of showing off a nice car. Part for a day in the life of a peasant? Let's follow an ordinary person through an ordinary day, because this is really the heart of the whole thing. You wake at dawn, sometimes earlier. There's no clock. Your day runs on sunlight and church bells, which rang out set times for prayer that everyone in the village used to structure their day. Farming doesn't care about your feelings, so you're out working the moment there's enough light to see. Men and women both work the land, though the specific jobs often split by gender. Men plowing, women handling the garden, dairy, poultry, brewing. Kids work too, from a shockingly young age by our standards. A 7-year-old wasn't in school. They were scaring birds off crops or watching younger siblings. Most peasants didn't own their land outright. They worked land belonging to a lord in exchange for protection and the right to farm a portion for themselves. This is the feudal system people vaguely remember from school. And yes, it was often unfair and rigid, but it wasn't universal slavery either. There were serfs, tied to the land and unable to leave without permission, and there were free peasants who had more room to move and negotiate. The line between the two mattered a lot to the people living it, even if from a distance it all looks the same to us. Work stopped for the big meal of the day around midday, then continued into the afternoon. Come evening, there wasn't a lot of leisure time, but there was some storytelling, music, games with dice, or simple boards, and a whole lot of just sitting around the fire talking, because that was basically free entertainment. And then bed. Early, because candles and oil lamps were expensive and you needed to be up again in a few hours anyway. Repeat that 6 days a week for your entire life, with Sunday off for church and rest. Part 5. The myth of the flat earth and other things people get wrong? Okay, we need to talk about this one because it comes up constantly. Medieval people did not think the earth was flat. This is one of the most persistent myths out there, and it's just false. Educated people in medieval Europe, and honestly, most literate cultures going back to the ancient Greeks, knew the earth was a sphere. Sailors knew it. Scholars wrote about it. Monasteries taught it. The medieval people thought the world was flat idea actually got popularized much later, in the 1800s, partly through a badly researched biography of Columbus that made his voyage sound braver by pretending everyone thought he'd sail off the edge of the world. He didn't think that. Nobody serious thought that. Another myth, that medieval people were all filthy and never bathed. Also mostly wrong. Bathing was actually pretty common, especially in towns with public bathhouses. It was later, in the 1500s and 1600s, during outbreaks of plague, that bathing actually became less popular because people believed hot water opened your pores and let disease in. So ironically, people got dirtier after the medieval period, not during it. And the life expectancy was like 35 thing gets misunderstood constantly. Average life expectancy was dragged down hard by infant and child mortality. A huge number of children didn't survive past age 5. But if you made it to adulthood, living into your 60s or even 70s wasn't rare at all. The average is misleading. It's not that everyone dropped dead at 35, it's that a lot of babies didn't make it, which pulls the whole number down. Part 6. The people above the peasants? Let's climb the social ladder for a bit. Above the peasants were knights and lords, the nobility, whose whole social position was tied to land ownership and military service. Becoming a knight wasn't just picking up a sword. It usually started in boyhood, as a page in someone else's household, then a squire serving a knight directly, learning combat, horsemanship, and courtly manners, before finally being knighted, often in your late teens or early 20s. Life for the nobility looked completely different from peasant life, but it wasn't the glamorous fairy tale we picture either. Castles were cold, drafty, and honestly not that comfortable most of the year. Heating a giant stone building with fireplaces only gets you so far. Nobles ate better, dressed better, and had more free time, sure, but they also carried constant pressure to defend their land, manage disputes, and maintain loyalty from the people under them. It was less living in a fairy tale and more running a small, tense business that occasionally involved warfare. Above the nobles sat kings, and above kings, in terms of spiritual authority, sat the church, which brings us to maybe the single most powerful institution in medieval daily life. Part 7. The church was everywhere? It's hard to overstate how much the church shaped everyday life. This wasn't about going to a service once a week and calling it done. The church controlled the calendar, feast days, fasting days, holy days that doubled as the only real breaks from work most peasants got. It controlled education, since monasteries were often the only places anyone learned to read. It controlled a huge amount of land and wealth. And it controlled the story people told themselves about why the world worked the way it did. Church bells structured the actual hours of the day. Confession and communion were regular parts of life. And belief in an afterlife wasn't abstract. Heaven and hell were treated as completely real. And the 8 concerns, which shaped decisions about morality, charity, and even how people faced death. That said, plenty of ordinary people mixed official church teaching with older folk beliefs, charms, local superstitions, remedies passed down that had nothing to do with official theology. Religion in daily practice was messier and more personal than the official version taught from the pulpit. Part 8. Getting sick, and why IT was terrifying? Medicine is one of the areas where medieval life gets genuinely rough by modern standards. So let's be honest about it. Doctors existed, but medical theory was based on the humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile, and the idea that illness came from these being out of balance. Treatments often involved bloodletting, specific diets, or herbal remedies. Some herbal knowledge was genuinely useful and passed down through generations of trial and error. Some of it did basically nothing, or actively made things worse. Childbirth was dangerous for both mother and baby, without modern hygiene practices or emergency intervention. Infection from even minor wounds could turn fatal fast. Because nobody understood germs yet, that's still centuries away. Surgery existed, mostly for injuries and battlefield wounds, performed without real anesthesia beyond alcohol or herbal sedatives, which is about as brutal as it sounds. And then there was the plague. The Black Death hit Europe starting in 1347 and, within just a few years, killed somewhere between a third and half of the entire population. Try to actually sit with that number for a second. Whole villages emptied out. Nobody understood what caused it. Theories ranged from bad air to divine punishment to conspiracy theories blaming minority groups, which led to horrific persecution alongside the disease itself. The plague didn't just kill people. It reshaped medieval society afterward. With so many workers dead, surviving peasants suddenly had leverage they never had before. Labor was scarce, so wages went up, and the rigid feudal system started cracking under the pressure. Some historians actually trace the slow decline of feudalism partly back to the labor shortage the plague created. A horrifying tragedy that, decades later, ended up shifting the balance of power between lords and peasants. Part 9. Women's Lives. Women's experiences varied a lot depending on class, region, and time period, so it's worth resisting the urge to flatten it into one simple story. For peasant women, life meant real, essential labor, running the household, managing food production, textile work, raising children, and often working the fields alongside men during harvest. Their economic contribution was completely necessary to a family's survival, even if legal and social power tilted heavily toward men. Noble women had different constraints. Marriages were often arranged for political or economic alliance rather than personal choice, and a noble woman's main expected role was securing an heir and managing the household while her husband was away, which happened a lot, whether for war, politics, or crusading. But there were exceptions worth knowing about. Women ran businesses in towns, particularly in trades like brewing and textiles. Abbesses ran convents that functioned as significant centers of learning and even political influence. Figures like Hildegard of Bingen wrote music, theology, and scientific texts that are still studied today. It wasn't equality by any modern definition, but it also wasn't the flat, silent picture some movies suggest. Part 10. Towns, Trade, and the Rise of the Middle Class. As the medieval period went on, towns grew, and something new started happening, a merchant and artisan class that didn't fit neatly into the old peasant noble clergy structure. Craft guilds formed around specific trades: blacksmiths, weavers, bakers, carpenters, regulating quality, training apprentices, and protecting members' economic interests. Becoming a master craftsman took years, starting as a child apprentice, living with and working under a master for room, board, and training, before eventually becoming a journeyman and, if skilled and lucky enough, a master with your own workshop. Markets were the center of town life, loud, crowded, full of specific smells, depending on which part of the market you were standing in. Fresh bread near the bakers, fish near the fishmongers, and livestock somewhere you'd rather not be downwind of. Trade brought goods from across Europe and beyond. Silk from the East, spices, dyes, metals, connecting even a fairly small medieval town to a much bigger world than we usually give it credit for. This growing merchant class eventually became genuinely powerful, laying groundwork for the shift away from the rigid feudal structure of the earlier medieval centuries. Part 11. Fun, games, and what people did for joy. It wasn't all work and grim survival. People had fun, genuinely, regularly. Festivals tied to the church calendar brought entire villages together for feasting, dancing, and games. Sports existed too, some of which look wild by today's standards. A version of medieval football that was basically an unregulated brawl between entire villages with almost no rules and, occasionally, serious injuries. Storytelling and music were huge, especially since most people couldn't read. Traveling performers, minstrels, and storytellers carried news and entertainment between towns. Board games and dice games were common, with archaeologists finding gaming pieces at sites across medieval Europe. Chess arrived in Europe during this period too, brought along trade routes from further east, and became especially popular among the nobility. And weddings, births, and deaths all came with their own traditions and celebrations, giving structure and meaning to a life that could otherwise feel like an endless cycle of labor. Part 12. So what do we actually take from all this? Here's what strikes me most. Putting all of this together, medieval people weren't stupider than us, weren't less emotionally complex, weren't just extras in someone else's historical drama waiting for the Renaissance to save them. They fell in love, argued with their neighbors, worried about money, laughed at bad jokes, grieved people they lost, and built entire complex systems, economic, religious, legal, to make sense of a world that, honestly, wasn't any less confusing than ours. They just did it with worse dentistry, no antibiotics, and a genuinely terrifying amount of respect for how quickly things could go wrong. A bad harvest, an infected cut, a passing illness that today we treat with a 5-day course of medicine and barely think about again. Next time you picture the Middle Ages, maybe don't picture Hollywood mud and dragons. Picture a person waking up before dawn, tending a fire, worrying about the harvest, and trying, same as we are right now, to build a decent life out of whatever they'd been handed. If you want more videos like this, real history, no fluff, no myths pretending to be facts, subscribe, and let me know down in the comments what era you want